The morning mist clung to the mountainsides like a grandmother's quilt, soft and comforting. Walter Harper shuffled across the wooden planks of his back porch. At 75, his joints protested the early autumn chill, but 43 years of running Harper's bait and fish had trained his body to wake before dawn. The familiar routine was all that kept the loneliness at bay these days. "Another day, Martha," he whispered to the framed photograph on his kitchen windowsill, the one where his late wife smiled beside their wedding cake. "Another day without you." The silence that answered him was the same silence that had filled the small wooden house for the past 3 years, ever since cancer had taken Martha away. Walter pulled on his weathered flannel jacket and stepped outside, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. Willow Creek, Montana, wasn't much more than a dot on most maps, but it had been home to the Harper family for over 4 decades. Walter's father had started the bait and fish shop back in 1981, and Walter had inherited both the business and the stubborn determination to keep it running. No matter how many big-box sporting goods stores opened in the larger towns nearby, the shop sat just 20 yards from his house, a modest building with faded blue siding and a hand-painted sign that read, "Harper's Bait and Fish, Fresh Catch Daily." Walter had painted that sign himself when he was 50, back when his hands were steadier and his heart fuller. Now, as he unlocked the shop door and flicked on the fluorescent lights, he tried not to think about how empty the place felt without Martha's humming drifting from the small office in the back. She used to handle the books while he arranged the fish displays, her voice a constant cheerful presence that made even the longest days feel manageable. "Walter, honey, did Mrs. Peterson pay for that salmon yet?" she'd call out. "Or don't forget to order more night crawlers for this weekend." Now the office sat dark, the ledger books gathering dust since Walter had reluctantly switched to a simple calculator and a spiral notebook to track his sales. He wheeled the first cart of iced fish from the walk-in cooler, the familiar smell of fresh trout and bass filling his nostrils. The morning routine was sacred: arrange the fish by size and type, check the bait supplies, make sure the live minnow tanks were running properly. Each task was performed with the same methodical care he'd learned from his father, who'd learned it from his grandfather back in Minnesota. Walter was positioning a particularly impressive rainbow trout when he heard a soft whimpering sound coming from behind the stack of old wooden crates near the shop's side entrance. He paused, his weathered hand still holding the fish, and listened. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. "Probably just Mrs. Chen's cat," he muttered to himself. But something about the sound made him set down the trout and investigate. Behind the crates, huddled in a small depression between 2 boxes, was the most pitiful sight Walter had seen in years. A baby black bear, no bigger than a large house cat, sat trembling in the morning shadows. Its fur was matted with mud and pine needles, and its dark eyes, so large they seemed to take up half its tiny face, stared up at Walter with a mixture of fear and desperate hunger. "Well, I'll be damned," Walter breathed, crouching down slowly so as not to startle the little creature. "Where's your mama, little fella?" The cub whimpered again, a sound so heartbreaking that Walter felt his chest tighten. Living this close to the Bitterroot National Forest, he'd seen plenty of bears over the years, but always from a distance, and never a cub this young on its own. The little one was clearly lost, probably separated from its mother during the night. Walter glanced around the deserted main street of Willow Creek. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning, most folks wouldn't be stirring for another hour at least. He looked back at the cub, which hadn't moved but continued to watch him with those enormous, trusting eyes. "You stay right there, little guy," Walter said softly. "I'm going to make some phone calls." Inside the shop, Walter dialed the number for the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Department, his fingers fumbling slightly with the rotary phone he'd refused to replace, despite Martha's years of gentle nagging about getting something more modern. Ranger Station, this is Tom Bradley speaking. Tom, it's Walter Harper down in Willow Creek. I've got a situation here. Found a baby black bear behind my shop. Can't be more than a few weeks old, and there's no sign of the mother. There was a pause on the other end. That's unusual for this time of year, Walter. Most cubs stick close to their mothers through their first winter. You sure it's alone? Been watching it for the past 15 minutes. Nothing bigger than a chipmunk has stirred in these woods. We'll send someone down, but it might be a few hours. Keep your distance, and whatever you do, don't try to feed it. Last thing we need is a bear that associates humans with food. Walter hung up and returned to the cub, which hadn't moved from its spot behind the crates. If anything, it looked even smaller and more pathetic than before, its little body shivering despite the thick fur. Rangers are coming, little fella, Walter said, settling onto an overturned milk crate a safe distance away. They'll know what to do with you. But as the minutes ticked by, Walter found himself growing more attached to the small creature. There was something about the way it watched him, not with the wild wariness he'd expect from a bear, but with an almost human-like curiosity. When Walter moved to rearrange some fishing gear, the cub's head turned to follow his movements. When he spoke, its ears perked up attentively. It reminded him of the way Martha used to watch him work in the shop, content just to be in his presence. 3 hours later, Tom Bradley arrived with his partner, Sarah White, both dressed in the khaki uniforms of the State Wildlife Service. They examined the cub from several angles, taking photos and making notes on official-looking clipboards. Poor little guy is definitely malnourished, Sarah observed, her voice gentle despite her professional demeanor. Probably hasn't eaten in days. What happens now? Walter asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tom sighed and shook his head. Normally, we transport it to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center over in Missoula, but they're completely full right now. Seasonal influx, you know, lots of animals preparing for winter hibernation. Even if they had space, the roads through the mountains are getting dicey with the early snow. So, what are you suggesting? Best thing would be to let nature take its course, Tom said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Cubs this age are resourceful. It might find its way back to its mother or it might starve to death, Walter finished. The two rangers exchanged glances. We can't officially recommend anything else, Sarah said carefully. But if someone were to, say, provide some temporary care until we could arrange transport. How temporary? Could be weeks, Tom admitted. Maybe longer, depending on the weather and the situation in Missoula. Walter looked at the cub, which had been following their conversation with apparent interest, its head turning from speaker to speaker like a spectator at a tennis match. Those dark eyes seemed to hold an intelligence that went beyond simple animal instinct. I'll need to think about it, Walter said after the rangers left, promising to check back in a few days. Walter sat alone with the cub as the afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees. The morning rush of fishermen had come and gone, Jake Morrison picking up his usual 24 night crawlers, old Pete Kowalski grabbing a bag of ice for his cooler, Mrs. Patterson buying rainbow trout for her weekly fish fry. All of them had glanced curiously at the small bear behind the crates, but none had seemed particularly alarmed. Folks in Willow Creek were used to wildlife wandering through town. As closing time approached, Walter made his decision. He walked to the grocery store next door, Peterson's Market, run by the same family that had been serving Willow Creek for 30 years, and picked up a small container of goat milk and some canned salmon. "Planning to do some cooking tonight?" Walter asked Jenny Peterson, Pete's daughter-in-law, as she rang up his purchases. "Something like that," Walter replied, not quite ready to explain his unusual new house guest. Back at the shop, he approached the cub slowly, speaking in the same gentle tone he'd once used with Martha when she was feeling poorly. "I don't know much about taking care of bears, little fella, but I figure you must be hungry." He set a shallow dish of goat milk and a small piece of salmon about 3 feet from the cub's hiding spot, then retreated to give the animal space. For long minutes, nothing happened. The cub watched him suspiciously, its nose twitching at the unfamiliar scent. Then, moving with the careful deliberation of a creature that had learned not to trust easily, the cub crept forward. It sniffed the salmon first, then gave it a tentative lick. Walter held his breath, afraid that any movement would send the little bear scurrying back to its hiding place. The cub took a small bite of the fish, chewed thoughtfully, then began to eat with more enthusiasm. When it finished the salmon, it turned to the milk, lapping at it with a tiny pink tongue that was almost cat-like in its delicacy. As Walter watched, something extraordinary happened. The cub finished its meal, looked around the immediate area, then picked up a small dried leaf in its mouth. Moving with purpose, it carried the leaf to Walter's feet and dropped it there as if offering payment for the meal. "Well, I'll be damned," Walter whispered, staring down at the leaf. "You're a polite little guy, aren't you?" The cub sat back on its haunches and looked up at Walter expectantly, as if waiting for acknowledgement of its gesture. Walter bent down slowly and picked up the leaf, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Thank you kindly," he said formally. "This is a very fine leaf indeed." The cub made a sound that was somewhere between a purr and a grunt, then waddled back to its spot behind the crates with what Walter could have sworn was satisfaction. That evening, as Walter sat in his kitchen eating a solitary dinner of canned soup and crackers, he found himself thinking about the small bear. The house felt even emptier than usual, the silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room and the occasional creak of settling wood. He'd built this house with Martha in 1987, back when they'd still been hopeful about having children. The extra bedrooms they'd planned for little ones had eventually become Martha's craft room and Walter's workshop. But they'd never regretted the space. Now, though, the house felt too big for one old man and his memories. Around 9 o'clock, Walter found himself putting on his jacket and walking back to the shop with a flashlight. He told himself he was just checking to make sure everything was secure for the night, but really he wanted to see if the cub was still there. It was curled up in the same spot behind the crates, but now it had somehow managed to drag an old burlap sack over itself like a blanket. When Walter's flashlight beam found it, the cub lifted its head sleepily, blinked once, then settled back down without any sign of fear. "Good night, little fella," Walter whispered. "Sleep tight." The next morning, Walter found another leaf waiting by the shop's front door. This one, a perfectly shaped pine needle that looked as if it had been carefully selected. The cub sat nearby, watching Walter discover its gift with what seemed like anticipation. "Another payment, huh?" Walter said, pocketing the pine needle. "I guess that means you'll be wanting breakfast." And so began what would become a daily routine. Each morning, the cub, whom Walter had begun thinking of as Cubby, though he hadn't said the name out loud yet, would present some small token from the forest, a pine needle, a smooth pebble, a particularly interesting twig. Walter would accept each gift with solemn gratitude, then provide breakfast in return. Word of the arrangement spread quickly through Willow Creek's small community. By the end of the week, Walter had fielded calls from half the town, all wanting to know about the bear that pays for its food. Nobody seemed alarmed by Cubby's presence. If anything, people were charmed by the idea of a polite bear cub conducting business transactions. Mrs. Patterson started bringing overripe apples from her orchard. The Henderson kids, ages 7 and 9, convinced their mother to let them contribute berries they'd picked during a family hike. Even gruff old Pete Kowalski showed up one afternoon with a jar of honey, claiming his wife had insisted, but secretly pleased to be part of the town's newest story. "Never seen anything like it," Pete told Walter as they watched Cubby carefully examine a piece of honeycomb. "My grandfather used to tell stories about bears that were smarter than people, but I always figured he was just spinning yarns." "This little guy does seem unusual," Walter agreed, watching as Cubby finished the honey and then spent several minutes searching the ground until he found a small stick worthy of offering as his payment. As September turned to October, Cubby grew more comfortable around humans but maintained his careful politeness. He would emerge from his hiding spot whenever customers arrived, sitting at a respectful distance and watching the transactions with apparent interest. Sometimes he would even stand on his hind legs to get a better view, his expression so serious and businesslike that people couldn't help but smile. "He's studying you," observed Dr. Amanda Chen, the town's veterinarian, during one of her visits to buy fish for her own dinner. "Learning how commerce works. You think he understands what's happening?" "Bears are incredibly intelligent," Dr. Chen said, watching as Cubby carefully arranged a small pile of pine cones near the shop entrance. "Some researchers believe they're capable of abstract thinking. This little guy has clearly made the connection between offering something and receiving something in return." The nights were getting colder, and Walter began to worry about Cubby's comfort. The cub had claimed a spot under the shop's covered side porch, and Walter had provided an old blanket and a wooden crate for shelter, but the temperatures were dropping fast. Montana winters were nothing to trifle with, especially for a young bear that should have been denning up with its mother. After much internal debate, Walter called Tom Bradley again. "Tom, it's Walter Harper. I need to talk to you about that cub." "How's he doing?" "Fine, but winter's coming and I'm concerned about him surviving the cold. What would happen if I wanted to provide more permanent shelter?" There was a long pause. "Walter, you know I can't officially sanction keeping a wild bear as a pet." "What if it wasn't as a pet? What if it was as a rescue situation?" "That's different. We'd need documentation from a veterinarian, proof that the animal can't survive in the wild, and approval from the county. Plus, you'd be taking on full legal responsibility." "What kind of documentation?" "Physical examination, assessment of the animal's ability to fend for itself, that sort of thing. Dr. Chen could probably handle it." Walter hung up and immediately called Amanda Chen's office. Within an hour, she was at the shop with her medical bag, approaching Cubby with the calm professionalism that had made her Willow Creek's most trusted veterinarian. "Hello there, little man," she said softly, settling onto the ground a few feet from where Cubby sat watching her. "I hear you're quite the businessman." As if understanding that this was an important moment, Cubby stood up and walked slowly toward Dr. Chen, stopping just within arm's reach. She extended her hand palm up, and after a moment's consideration, Cubby sniffed it, then gently bumped it with his nose. "Good boy," she murmured, beginning her examination. "Let's see what we're working with here." 20 minutes later, Dr. Chen sat back with a troubled expression. "Walter, this cub has a significant deformity in his left rear leg. The bone development is incomplete, probably a birth defect. He'll never be able to climb properly or move with the speed and agility a wild bear needs to survive." "What does that mean?" "It means if you release him back into the forest, he'll either starve or end up in someone's garbage cans looking for food. Either scenario ends badly for him." She looked at Cubby, who was now investigating her medical bag with careful curiosity. "But he's perfectly healthy otherwise, and his temperament is remarkably gentle. With proper care, he could live a long, happy life." "As someone's pet?" "As a rescued animal in a controlled environment. There's a difference, legally speaking." That evening, Walter sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee, watching Cubby explore the yard between the house and the shop. The cub moved with a slight limp that Walter had noticed but hadn't understood the significance of until Dr. Chen's examination. Now he watched with new eyes, seeing how Cubby favored his right side, how he moved more slowly and deliberately than a healthy bear cub would. "You and me both, little guy," Walter said quietly, thinking of his own arthritic joints. "Getting around isn't as easy as it used to be." As if hearing his thoughts, Cubby looked up from the fallen log he'd been investigating and made his way over to the porch. To Walter's surprise, the cub climbed the 3 wooden steps and settled down next to Walter's rocking chair, leaning against the old man's leg with a contented sigh. "Well, now," Walter said, gently resting his hand on Cubby's head. "I guess that settles it." The next day, Walter began the process of officially adopting Cubby as a rescue animal. The paperwork was extensive: applications to the state wildlife department, legal liability forms, plans for proper housing and care. Dr. Chen helped with the medical documentation, and Tom Bradley provided guidance on the regulatory requirements. But the most important document came from the people of Willow Creek themselves. Somehow, word had spread about Walter's plan to keep Cubby permanently. And by Thursday afternoon, a delegation led by Mayor Susan Peterson arrived at the shop with a petition. "We've been talking," Mayor Peterson announced, unrolling a scroll of paper that seemed to go on forever. "And we think it's time Willow Creek had an official town mascot." Walter stared at the petition, his eyes growing wide as he saw page after page of signatures. Every adult in town had signed, along with shaky letters from children who had insisted on adding their names. Some of the youngest kids had pressed their tiny fingers into ink pads and left fingerprints next to their parents' signatures. "This is," Walter's voice caught. "This is more than 100 signatures." 137, Mayor Peterson said proudly, including old Mr. Kowalski. "And you know how he feels about government paperwork." "The way we see it," added Jenny Peterson, "Cubby's already part of the community. Might as well make it official." Walter looked down at the petition, then at Cubby, who was sitting beside him with his usual attentive expression. In the distance, he could see Martha's grave in the small cemetery behind the church, marked by the simple headstone he'd chosen because she'd always preferred understated elegance. For the first time in 3 years, Walter felt like he was part of something larger than his own grief. "I think Martha would have liked him," he said softly. "She would have loved him," corrected Mrs. Patterson, who had known Martha since childhood. "She always did have a soft spot for strays." Within a week, all the paperwork was approved. Cubby was officially designated as a special rescue animal under the care of Walter Harper, with the full support of the Willow Creek community. Walter built a proper enclosure behind the shop, not a cage, but a fenced area with a sturdy wooden shelter, plenty of room to roam, and a gate that could be left open during business hours. But Cubby seemed to prefer staying close to Walter in the shop. Most mornings, he could be found sitting patiently by the front door, a carefully selected twig or pine cone in his mouth, ready to pay for his breakfast. During business hours, he would position himself near the fish counter, watching Walter serve customers with the same focused attention a student might give to a master craftsman. And gradually, something wonderful began to happen. Cubby started to imitate Walter's movements. When Walter weighed fish on the old scale, Cubby would stand on his hind legs to get a better view. When Walter handed a package to a customer, Cubby would reach out with his front paws as if offering something of his own. One October morning, while Walter was struggling to tie twine around a particularly large package of salmon steaks, Cubby approached and gently took one end of the string in his mouth, holding it steady while Walter completed the knot. The customer, a visiting fisherman from Billings, stared in amazement. "Did that bear just help you package my fish?" "Seems like it," Walter said, patting Cubby's head. "He's a good assistant. I've got to tell my wife about this. She'll never believe it." And that was how Cubby's career as Walter's business partner officially began. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Willow Creek in a thick layer of snow by mid-November. Walter had worried about how Cubby would handle the cold, but the young bear seemed to thrive in the winter weather. His coat grew thick and lustrous, and he moved through the snow with surprising grace despite his weak leg. More importantly, Cubby had become an integral part of Harper's bait and fish. Word of the bear cashier had spread far beyond Willow Creek, and the shop began attracting visitors from across Montana and beyond. People drove hours out of their way just to see Cubby in action. Walter had initially been concerned about turning his shop into a tourist attraction, but he quickly realized that Cubby had a natural talent for customer service. The bear seemed to understand that each visitor was special, and he treated them all with the same careful politeness he'd shown Walter from the beginning. The routine became well established. When customers entered the shop, Cubby would approach and extend one front paw in what looked exactly like a welcoming wave. When they made purchases, he would clap his paws together in apparent approval. And when Walter handed him their money, Cubby would carefully carry it back to the register, then return to collect their package and present it to them with a gentle nudge of his nose. "He's better with customer service than most humans," observed Rebecca Martinez, a travel writer from Denver who'd driven up specifically to write about Cubby for a regional magazine. "I've never seen anything like it." "Neither have I," Walter admitted, watching as Cubby carefully arranged a pile of pine cones near the entrance, his morning payment for breakfast. "Sometimes I think he understands this business better than I do." The article Rebecca wrote brought even more visitors, and soon Harper's bait and fish was mentioned in travel guides and featured on social media posts that reached thousands of people. Walter had to hire Jenny Peterson's teenage son, Marcus, to help with the increased crowds on weekends. But success brought new challenges. Some visitors seemed to view Cubby as nothing more than a performing animal, and Walter had to establish firm rules about appropriate behavior: no touching without permission, no loud noises or sudden movements, no attempting to feed Cubby anything other than the approved treats Walter provided. "He's not a circus act," Walter explained patiently to a family from California who had been trying to get Cubby to pose for increasingly elaborate photos. He's a member of our community, and he deserves respect. Most visitors understood and appreciated the privilege of witnessing Cubby's unique abilities. Children especially seemed to recognize something special about the young bear. They would sit quietly and watch as Cubby went through his daily routines, their eyes wide with wonder. "He knows things," whispered 8-year-old Emma Chen, Dr. Chen's niece, during one of her visits to the shop. "Like people things." "What kind of people things?" Walter asked, genuinely curious about the child's perspective. "He knows when someone is sad," Emma said matter-of-factly. "And he knows when they need a friend." Walter thought about that observation as winter deepened and the short days blended into long, cold nights. Cubby had indeed seemed to sense something in him that first day behind the crates, a loneliness that matched his own. And in the months since, their bond had grown into something Walter could only describe as family. Every evening after closing the shop, Walter and Cubby would return to the small house together. Walter had created a special corner for Cubby near the fireplace, complete with a thick fur rug and a collection of wooden toys that the bear seemed to enjoy gnawing on. During the coldest nights, Cubby would curl up on the rug while Walter sat in his rocking chair, both of them comfortable in the warm glow of the fire. "Martha would have spoiled you rotten," Walter told Cubby one particularly frigid evening in January. "She was always bringing home strays, birds with broken wings, cats that were too skinny, even a baby raccoon once." Cubby lifted his head from his paws and made the soft grunting sound that Walter had learned meant contentment. Sometimes on nights like this, Walter would find himself talking to Cubby the way he used to talk to Martha, sharing the small details of his day, his concerns about the business, his memories of better times. The bear was an excellent listener, never interrupting, always attentive, and somehow having Cubby there made the house feel less empty, the silence less oppressive. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Cubby was now almost fully grown, weighing nearly 200 pounds, but still maintaining the gentle demeanor that had made him so beloved in Willow Creek. Dr. Chen's regular checkups confirmed that he was healthy and well-adjusted, though his leg deformity had become more pronounced as he grew. "He'll never be a wild bear," she told Walter during one of her visits. "But he's something better. He's himself." The tourists returned with the warmer weather, and Cubby resumed his role as the shop's star attraction. But Walter noticed something new in the bear's behavior. Cubby seemed to be studying the visitors more intently, watching their faces and body language with an almost human-like perceptiveness. One afternoon, a young couple from Seattle came into the shop with their 5-year-old son, who was clearly terrified of Cubby, despite his parents' reassurances. The boy hid behind his mother's legs, peeking out at the bear with wide, frightened eyes. Instead of approaching with his usual welcoming wave, Cubby seemed to sense the child's fear. He sat down at a distance and began playing with one of his wooden toys, rolling it back and forth with his paws in a deliberately silly manner. After a few minutes, the little boy began to giggle. By the time the family left, the child was waving goodbye to Cubby with enthusiasm. "How did he know to do that?" the mother asked Walter in amazement. "I honestly don't know," Walter replied, watching as Cubby carefully arranged the day's payment of pine cones and interesting stones near the register. "But he always seems to know exactly what people need." As summer arrived, bringing with it the busiest tourist season in the shop's history, Walter began to notice the toll that constant interaction was taking on both himself and Cubby. At 76, he found the long days increasingly exhausting, and even Cubby seemed to need more rest between customer visits. Dr. Chen suggested they implement quiet hours, During the hottest part of the day, when both Walter and Cubby could retreat to the air-conditioned back room and rest. The visitors were understanding, especially when Marcus explained that even the hardest-working bear deserved a lunch break. It was during one of these quiet hours that Walter experienced what he would later describe as the most frightening day of his life. He had been feeling under the weather for several days, nothing serious, just a persistent cough and general fatigue that he attributed to the busy season. But on a particularly hot July afternoon, while Cubby napped in the back room, Walter suddenly found himself struggling to breathe. He managed to call Dr. Chen before collapsing into his chair behind the register, his chest tight with pain and his vision blurring at the edges. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was Cubby's concerned face hovering over him, the bear making distressed sounds that seemed almost human in their urgency. Walter woke up 3 days later in the hospital in Kalispell, surrounded by what seemed like half the population of Willow Creek. Dr. Chen explained that he'd suffered a mild heart attack complicated by pneumonia that had gone undiagnosed for too long. "You're going to be fine," she assured him. "But you need to take better care of yourself. No more 16-hour days, and definitely no more ignoring symptoms." "What about Cubby?" Walter asked weakly. "Who's been taking care of him?" "The whole town," laughed Mayor Peterson from her seat near the window. "We've had volunteers around the clock. Jenny's been managing the shop. Marcus has been handling the tourists. And Pete Kowalski has appointed himself Cubby's personal chef. He's been asking for you, though," added Mrs. Patterson. "Won't eat properly. Just sits by the front door of the shop waiting." Walter felt his chest tighten with emotion. "I need to see him." "Tomorrow," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Today, you rest." But even from his hospital bed, Walter could feel the pull of home, the knowledge that Cubby needed him as much as he needed the bear. That night, as he lay listening to the beeping monitors and distant hospital sounds, Walter made a decision that surprised even him. The next afternoon, against Dr. Chen's wishes but with her reluctant permission, Walter was driven back to Willow Creek in the passenger seat of Tom Bradley's Ranger vehicle. As they pulled up in front of Harper's Bait and Fish, Walter could see Cubby sitting exactly where Mrs. Patterson had described, right by the front door, his posture radiating patient but unmistakable sadness. The moment Cubby saw Walter emerge from the truck, the bear's entire demeanor changed. He stood up, looked around as if to make sure this wasn't a dream, then lumbered over to Walter with more speed than anyone had seen from him in days. But instead of his usual exuberant greeting, Cubby approached slowly and gently pressed his forehead against Walter's chest, making the soft grunting sound that meant contentment and relief. "I missed you, too, boy," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere." The reunion brought tears to the eyes of the gathered crowd, and even gruff old Pete Kowalski was seen wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. From that day forward, the bond between Walter and Cubby deepened, a silent understanding that transcended species. Walter's health improved, and he began taking Dr. Chen's advice, working shorter hours and taking more time to rest. Cubby, ever the attentive partner, would nudge him toward his rocking chair during quiet moments, or gently remind him when it was time for his afternoon nap. Harper's Bait and Fish continued to thrive, a testament to the extraordinary partnership between an old man and a remarkable bear. Tourists still flocked to Willow Creek, but now they came not just to see the bear cashier, but to witness the enduring affection between Walter and Cubby. The story of the bear who paid for his fish with leaves and pine cones became a local legend, A heartwarming tale whispered around campfires and told to wide-eyed children. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Walter sat on his porch, watching Cubby, now a magnificent, fully grown bear, though still with a gentle limp, meticulously arrange a collection of particularly vibrant fall leaves near the shop entrance. He smiled, a genuine, full smile that hadn't graced his face in years before Cubby. The silence that had once been so oppressive in his house was now filled with the comforting sounds of Cubby's contented grunts and the occasional rustle of leaves as he prepared his daily offering. Walter knew that Martha would have loved this, the simple joy of companionship, the unexpected family they had found. He reached down and picked up a particularly colorful maple leaf, holding it gently in his hand. "Thank you, Cubby," he whispered, his voice filled with an old man's quiet gratitude. "Thank you for everything." And Cubby, as if understanding, gave a soft rumble and leaned his massive head against Walter's leg, a symbol of a love and friendship that truly melted hearts.